Welcome, everyone, to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and the Patreon members chose the next general to be covered, and it's James Ewell Brown Stuart, most commonly known as JEB Stuart, the dashing cavalier that brought General Robert E. Lee incredible intelligence through most of the Civil War. If you like what I do and would like to vote for the next general, you can join the Patreon page. You can also purchase something from the Teespring store or Etsy shop. Thank you all so much for your help. It was May 8, 1863, and a young cavalryman with an elegant red beard and a plumed hat rode into camp with a message for Army Commander Robert E. Lee and Corps Commander Thomas Stonewall Jackson. He informed both men that the Union Army's flank was in the air, meaning it wasn't anchored to prevent a flank attack. This piece of intelligence would result in one of the greatest victories for Lee at Chancellorsville. The horseman's name was James Ewell Brown Stuart, or more commonly known simply as Jeb. He was born on February 6, 1833 in Patrick County, Virginia, to Archibald and Elizabeth Letcher Pannell Stuart. Elizabeth's grandfather, Jeb's great-grandfather, was a patriot in the American Revolution. His patriotism was so well known that a loyalist in the county came to his home and shot him dead. Archibald's grandfather was also a patriot during the Revolution, leading a regiment at the Battle of Gettysburg courthouse. Archibald himself fought against the British during the War of 1812. Jeb's father became a politician after the war, first serving in the Virginia General Assembly and later the U.S. House of Representatives. While a delegate to Virginia's Constitutional Convention from 1829 to 1830, he fought against the slave population counting towards the representation in Virginia's districts, which would give more political power to non-slaveholding or small slaveholding whites, despite being a slave owner himself. This got him no friends with the more wealthier slave owners, and he was unseated in the next election for the General Assembly. Although Archibald was a prominent figure in Virginia, he wasn't wealthy or prosperous. He was said to be the life of the party and maybe liked to drink too much and possibly liked to gamble more than he should, because he did lose his inheritance. Jeb was born at Laurel Hill on land Elizabeth inherited from her martyred grandfather. Probably because of Archibald's fondness for alcohol, Elizabeth required her sons to make a pledge to never take a sip of alcohol, which Jeb did at the age of 12. Archibald, probably because Elizabeth was outspoken about her husband's behavior, stayed away from home a lot. Jeb was named after an uncle, the husband of one of Archibald's sisters, Judge James Ewell Brown. Being one of 10 children and the 7th born to Archibald and Elizabeth, Jeb had plenty of playmates in a large household. 28 slaves lived on the property along with 13 whites. Jeb performed chores with his brothers and sisters and explored the Patrick County countryside. Although Patrick County is technically in the Piedmont region of Virginia, it sits on the western edge, next to the Blue Ridge Mountains and borders North Carolina. Stuart's post office was at Mount Airy, North Carolina. He always enjoyed nature and relished in its beauty, often pressing flowers and leaves to preserve them. His poetry reflected his love of nature and expressed his amazement at natural processes. He also loved his animals, horses and dogs, having a kind heart toward them. One of Stuart's biographers described young Stuart as such. There was a tenderness about young Stuart. Sometimes he concealed it beneath the hardy facade with which he imitated his father. Sometimes he hid it behind a rigid zeal for principles reminiscent of his mother. Often he affected something like tenderness, put it on like a mask, to make himself appear properly genteel. But underneath all of this was the genuine article, the soul of a sensitive human being. Jeb was particularly close to his older brother William Alexander. When Alex was 15 and Jeb was 9, they found a hornet's nest on the farm. Determined to have the nest as a trophy, the young boys began throwing sticks at it, but couldn't bring it down. So they began to climb the tree, working their way from branch to branch. When they got close, the hornets came out of their nest and began stinging the boys. Alex wisely tumbled from the tree and got a safe distance away. Not to be outdone by hornets, Jeb just squinted his eyes and pressed on, getting stung multiple times, but getting his prize in the end. As one of his biographers stated, he had inherited both his pa's zest for good times and his mama's demanding standards. At age 12, he left Laurel Hill, only to return for short visits with the family. He went to school in Wytheville, Virginia, remarking to a cousin that he hadn't been in any fights since coming to the school. Within his family, Jeb was known as a fighter, and he made a commitment to himself that he would never be imposed upon, as he said. He added that his lack of conflict did not arise from his own cowardice, but from the timidity of his classmates. When the same cousin remarked that his school failed to serve butter with their food, Stuart responded, "I could not do without butter." While going to school in Wytheville, he lived with family in the area. Measles as well as mumps went around, with Stuart contracting both, but pulling through. He also worked in a law office, where he got to learn about his father's profession, but he remarked to a schoolteacher that he expected to teach. Stuart was bright, but he wasn't an intellectual. He valued his independence and self-reliance. During one Christmas break, he wanted to return home, but couldn't acquire a horse, so he set out on foot across the mountains. After traveling a great distance through what he called half-leg deep snow, he found the home of a relative and stayed there. Although he didn't make it to Laurel Hill, he was still proud of himself and his self-reliance, traveling by himself over such a great distance in horrible weather. Jeb wasn't heartbroken about being away from home for Christmas. He didn't have a close relationship with his parents. Letters were seldom sent to the young man from either his mother or his father. At one point, Jeb wrote to his mother, "I can't see why you don't write me, for you have no idea how acceptable a letter from home is to any son, but especially to one away off at a boarding school, where I never hear from home or anywhere else. I have no doubt that you all have experienced this, and for that reason it appears still more astounding why you do not have mercy upon a poor little insignificant whelp away from his mammy." Jeb became infatuated with women, something he never lost interest in. One of the reasons he wanted to be home during that snowstorm was because he was hoping to see a young lady whom he had become acquainted with. However, just like everyone else, he grew aggravated at one point and declared that he was done with women, that all they brought were trouble. But he quickly came around and flirted with the young ladies about town. He never could stay away from female companionship. After 3 years of schooling around Wytheville, Jeb entered Emory and Henry College at the age of 15. While there, a religious revival swept through the campus and Jeb was caught up in its fervor. It was a Methodist revival, and even though his mother was Episcopalian, Jeb seemed to have taken to this new denomination. Later in life, it would be difficult to find a letter that didn't have some kind of religious bent or nod within its paragraphs. While at Emory and Henry College, he joined a literary and debate society called the Hermesians. During a speech to the group, he became so overwhelmed by the moment, he didn't realize where he was at and fell off the platform on which he was speaking. Jeb didn't do well on exams. He got into a scuffle with one student where he got a bloody nose, then had to take a history exam. He lost 30 valuable minutes taking care of his nose instead of taking the exam, which he worried about greatly. At one point, he planned to place a Bible on his desk during exams to ward off the evils that threw obstacles in his way when taking those exams. After spending 2 years at Emory and Henry College, Jeb needed to decide what he would do once he got educated. Since he wouldn't inherit wealth or land, he needed to join what he called the hireling professions: law, medicine, engineering, and arms. Archibald ran for a seat in the House of Representatives again, but lost. However, his opponent, in one of his first acts, nominated Jeb to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He left Emory and Henry in April 1850, taking stagecoaches up the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, stopping briefly in Lynchburg and Salem, Virginia. At a stopover in Charlottesville, Jeb explored the University of Virginia and visited Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello, where he took with him a chip off the former president's tombstone and 2 roses from the garden. The women of Charlottesville attracted his attention as well, but not in a good way. He wrote that the women there were the ugliest of the ugly. Jeb then took a steamboat to Washington, D.C. He met President Zachary Taylor a few times walking down the streets while walking around the White House. After meeting the congressman who gave him the appointment, he journeyed to the Senate chamber to watch the proceedings. Jeb decided that Daniel Webster was the finest-looking man in the Senate and determined, of all the pleasant speakers, give me Jeff Davis of Mississippi. Henry Clay appeared very nervous, but possessed an air of dignity and command. Sam Houston appears better with his mouth shut than open. Lewis Cass is a fleshy old fellow with a very fat face. When Jeb went to the House chamber, he found it to be a rowdy place. From there, he grabbed a sprig of arbor vitae as a souvenir, then headed north. He officially became Cadet Stuart on July 1st, 1850. He wasn't a handsome young man at that point. His friends would call him Beauty, which came from his personal comeliness in inverse ratio to the term employed. He hadn't grown the now famous beard yet, but his auburn brown hair would be combed back and over his ears. His blue eyes would flash, twinkle, or pierce depending on his mood. He was still growing, and would grow to 5'10", and and was always characterized as sturdy with a barrel chest, but never considered fat, although he loved to eat. He would write, "It almost grieves me when I find myself unable to do justice to a meal for which I have to pay full price, for it has always been my consolation that I always got the worth of my money in the eating line, and precious little did a hotel keeper ever make off me." The erect way he carried himself made him appear taller than he actually was. Stuart had a beautiful voice whether he was issuing commands, singing, or in casual conversation. One cadet remembered that one of the highlights of drill was Stuart's almost musical way of issuing orders. The first summer at the academy was made up of the cadets living in tents and being drilled in infantry and artillery by upperclassmen and academy officials. Stuart quickly took to the military life. He described it as glorious to a cousin in a letter, and said that he could live like that the rest of his days if it remained warm enough. His physical prowess made him excel in athletics and anything that required being physically active. However, academics was another situation entirely. He would write, "I used to think I had some idea of what hard study was. At least my mind of it was that it was something to be avoided as much as possible, which before I came here I succeeded at admirably. But on coming here I found that it was necessary to cultivate a more intimate acquaintance with it, or else come out wanting at the examination. So I turned into studying pretty hard. Here every man's grading or standing is definitely established at every examination. It is not made out in decimals or by any complicated process of calculation, but simply his relative standing and his class, and this is published every June in a register to the world, so that if a man is foot, everybody knows it, and if he is head, everybody who wants to can know it." Stuart did okay in English studies. His letters contained a great amount of run-on sentences, and it seemed he had a hard time ending paragraphs, so they continued to be lengthy. But he excelled in mathematics, something he scored higher in than any other class he took, including cavalry tactics. The sectional tensions that consumed the first half of the 19th century across the country invaded the cadets' ranks as well. Some Southerners shunned Northerners, and Stuart himself didn't care for the look or manners of Northern women. He also spoke of the taint of free soul Yankeedom. Although he made these statements, it didn't stop him from befriending Northerners. Olive wrote as Howard from Maine was shunned by many of the cadets, and Southerners in particular, but Stuart befriended him anyway. Howard would recall later that, "I never can forget the manliness of JEB Stuart. He spoke to me, visited with me, and we became warm friends, often on Saturday afternoons visiting the young ladies of the post together. When Howard was sick in the infirmary, Superintendent Robert E. Lee visited him, then Stuart visited with his friend. Once Howard was well, Stuart and Howard visited with Lee and his family, something Stuart did often. Stuart often visited the Lees on Saturday evenings, with the superintendent, his wife, and even his daughter Mary taking a liking to the young man. Miss Lee even sent flowers to Stuart once." Oddly enough, one of Stuart's other dear friends at West Point was Lee's son, Custis Lee, one of the cadets responsible for ostracizing Howard. Throughout Stuart's life, he regularly made friends with two people who were bitter enemies. In Stuart's second year, he became a corporal. The second summer was a splendid time for Stuart, because he now held rank in the cadet corps, and he met Mary Pegram. She was the sister of a fellow classmate and good friend, John Pegram of Virginia. Stuart wrote to a cousin that Miss Mary is intelligent, fascinating, beautiful, and modest, and that she is a Virginian is an enumeration of by no means half of her excellent qualities. When she left with her mother after visiting John, Stuart was distraught and had the blues, as he said. He commented that he couldn't look at the rose she gave him preserved in a glass of water without missing her. In Stuart's third year, he finally got to perform cavalry tactics, and he cut an excellent figure on horseback. He laughed at how horribly the Yankee cadets rode their horses. His instructor was George H. Thomas, a fellow Virginian, and when the rain prevented them from being outside during the cavalry tactics, Thomas brought them inside to the basement of a building where they could ride their horses. More than once a cadet ran into a pillar in that basement and got hurt. From the way Thomas managed riding instructions, the cadets gave him a nickname that was to follow him throughout his career. The horses at West Point were too tired, old, and sick to handle hard riding, and Thomas tried to preserve their precarious health by preventing the cadets from riding too fast. In a normal practice session, a student would start moving at a walk, increase to a trot, then a canter, and then a gallop. During Thomas's sessions, the students moved from a walk to a trot and then eagerly awaited the order to speed up. Thomas almost always disappointed them by ordering slow trot and then walk. Amused and annoyed by their cavalry instructor's refusal to let them ride fast, the cadets started to call him Old Slow Trot, and the name stuck. Stuart wasn't an intellectual, but he was far from unintelligent. He confessed that he had always enjoyed the reputation of being pretty lazy, but lazy in some things, not all things, because even if his body was idle, his mind wasn't. He was constantly thinking. The summer of 1852 brought Stuart a 10-week furlough, like all cadets after completing their 2 years of courses. He only spent 10 days out of the 10 weeks at Laurel Hill. He spent most of his time visiting brothers, sisters, and cousins in Virginia. He spent a lot of time near Martinsville, Virginia, where Betty Hairston lived, his 16-year-old distant cousin. They picked blackberries and strolled around the garden. When he departed, she gave him a drinking gourd, and Stuart inscribed her name on it with his knife. The gourd would hang in his West Point barracks for the rest of the time he was at the academy. Although the infatuation seemed to take on a romantic bent, and he wrote lovingly to her, their relationship quickly became more about friendship, and Stuart confided in Betty, becoming one of his closest confidants. At West Point, Stuart became the center of attention for many of the ladies located there. At one point, he took Miss Lee and a few daughters of other faculty members on a picnic, along with 2 other cadets. However, Stuart lamented that he hadn't received one Valentine that year after all the devotion to the ladies the previous summer. During the 1853 summer encampment, the Dialectic Society, a debate society Stuart belonged to, chose Beauty to deliver the Declaration of Independence on the 4th of July. When he got up to speak, he explained, "I always thought I had enough brass, but when I rose before such an audience to perform the part assigned me, I felt quite embarrassed, and would have willingly crawfished if it had been possible. But I had to stand up to the rack, fodder or no fodder, so I put on a bold face and drove ahead." As Stuart neared graduation, he had a huge decision to make. Would he stay with the Army or become a civilian? Although he owed his country 8 years of service, the Army was too small to fit all the new cadets, so he could choose to leave the service after graduation. He wrote to his lawyer father, not seeking his advice, but telling him the situation. Rather than relying on his father, he wrote that he would trust in his heavenly Father to decide where he should go. Stuart did think about being a lawyer, but he couldn't convince himself that it was a good living, saying that it was too precarious of a job and too overcrowded of a profession. He gave no thought to being a farmer because he neither had a farm nor capital with which to buy one. Stuart graduated 13th in the West Point class of 1854, alongside many future Civil War generals like Archibald Gracie, John Pegram, Custis Lee, Stephen Dilly, James Deschler, William Dorsey Pender, and Stephen Weed. Stuart would stay with the Army. He found a home and family within the Army and among the West Pointers. He would say, "The taste of classmates for each other's society, particularly West Pointers, is unequaled by the strongest attachment, and what is more remarkable, it becomes more and more intense as time continues. A thought which makes me fear that out of the Army I will be miserably unhappy." Stuart spent the summer after his graduation visiting friends and family around Virginia and North Carolina. On one of his infrequent trips to Laurel Hill, he found his commission as a second lieutenant in the 2nd Mounted Rifles, who were on patrol near the Rio Grande in Texas. One of Stuart's biographers described the young soldier's mentality as he entered the Army. As he prepared to make his way in the big world, Stuart determined 2 things. He never wrote them down or articulated them to anyone, perhaps not even to himself, but he acted them out as surely as if he had. Stuart determined to live fully, to miss no opportunity, to experience life as richly and completely as he was able. He would accept whatever circumstances he found himself in, and do his best to make the best of the situation. Actually, this was a renewed determination. He had developed this approach to his life as a young boy away at school, and had been refining it ever since. Stuart also determined not to get lost. He would maintain contact with his friends and make sure that no one who could help him forgot him. In order to be promoted in a peacetime army, Stuart would have to promote himself. Stuart was ordered to join his new company at Fort McIntosh by mid-October. He left the day after he received the order, going to New York to purchase equipment, but stopped by Washington, D.C. first. There he found that a yellow fever scare in New Orleans resulted in his leave being extended, since he would have to travel through that city to his duty station. Stuart went on to New York to purchase his equipment, made a brief stop at West Point, then went back home to await his orders to journey west. By fall, Jeb journeyed to St. Louis, where he was again delayed because of yellow fever in New Orleans, but in late November he got on a steamboat destined for the city. When he arrived, the city didn't impress him. He stayed there only one night, then got on a steamer to take him to the Texas coast. While on the ship, a norther blew in and rocked the boat. Jeb was horribly seasick from the encounter. When the boat docked at Galveston, he was so ill that it took him 12 hours to realize that dry land was only a few steps away. Another boat ride along the Texas coast saw the boat dock next to the shore for 2 nights as it traveled along the coast. Stuart had difficulty sleeping amid the sounds of seagulls and wolves. When he landed at Corpus Christi, he waited there until a wagon train set off for Laredo, the location of his company. When he got to Laredo, he found that his company was further west at Fort Davis. Along the way, he hunted rabbits and wild hogs, but when he got to Fort Davis on January 19th, he discovered his company was even further west. 2 months after leaving St. Louis, Stuart finally joined his company on the Texas frontier. The expedition that the company was currently on was led by Major John S. Simonson. Their base camp was called Camp Stuart, named after a fellow soldier from South Carolina, not Jeb. From the base camp, the company split up looking for Native Americans, with Jeb's group going to the Guadalupe Mountains along the Mexican border, Jeb being in charge of the artillery, which consisted of 1 cannon. On the journey, they reached a place over 2,000 feet above the valley. Only a narrow trail led down from the precipice. Stuart enlisted the majority of the company to wrestle the carriage as well as the caisson down the trail, while he and a band of Texas Rangers lowered the barrel down the cliffs with ropes. When Stuart returned to camp with the gun reassembled, Simonson confessed that he thought he would never see that gun again, but Stuart had accomplished an amazing feat and brought back the artillery piece, safe and sound. When the company of men continued to chase after Comanches, they met another group of soldiers, this group led by Major James Longstreet. Both were chasing Indians across the difficult terrain. When Stuart's group made camp, a humongous gust of wind swept across the landscape, scattering their campfires, setting fire to the prairie, their tents, horses, and themselves. Many men had their beards singed by the flames. Stuart lost part of his belongings in the fire, having to write letters on partially burnt stationery. When the group made it back to their base camp, Stuart commented on that camp really felt like home to us, and our floorless, chairless, and comfortless tents looked luxurious after a week's shelter beneath the broad canopy of heaven. Stuart was only on the Texas frontier for about 3 months. During that time, he wore out a pair of thick-soled shoes and resorted to wearing a pair of embroidered slippers for a time. But it was also during this time in West Texas that he started growing his now iconic beard. He wrote to a dear friend that the beard so altered my physique that you could not recognize me. In the spring of 1855, the Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, created 2 cavalry regiments, the 1st and 2nd U.S. Cavalry. Competition was tough, but Davis leaned toward giving Southerners positions in those 2 units. Stuart would be chosen to be a part of the 1st U.S. Cavalry with the permanent rank of 2nd Lieutenant. His previous was only a brevet. Other future Civil War generals included within those 2 regiments' ranks were Albert Sidney Johnston, Joseph E. Johnston, George Thomas, John Bell Hood, Edmund Kirby Smith, Earl Van Dorn, William Hardy, and John Sedgwick. Jeb made it to Jefferson Barracks near St. Louis in June, and then Fort Leavenworth, Kansas by July, to report for duty as the quartermaster for the 1st U.S. Cavalry Regiment.